And then Asif is sitting there. He'll give us any inputs or anything like that. If
Okay, great.
Just a little bit louder.
Just a little louder? Is this good?
Yes.
See, I got a big mouth, so I don't have that problem. Asif was like, you need to tone it down for him. All right, so we'll do 5-second countdown and we'll go ahead and get started, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kerm Zaman. I'm the CEO of Fifth Tribe, and welcome to tonight's Campfire Innovation and Impact podcast. Tonight's guest is George Chochos from the Georgetown University Pivot Program. Thanks for joining us, George.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So tonight we're going to talk about a very interesting topic. It's an election year, and it's one of those things that kind of comes up frequently. We'll talk about incarceration in America. We're going to talk about George, his incredible journey, and some of the great work that he's doing at the Pivot Program. So why don't we get started by telling us a little about yourself? And we're both from New York, and so we could maybe start from that and talk about how you ended up here in DC.
Sure. So I grew up in Albany, New York. I kind of say that Albany kind of set me up for jail, and I think what I learned probably in the South Bronx set me up for prison. But around 18 years old, well, around 16, I was already kind of going down a downward spiral. Around 18, I was arrested for the first time. At 20 years old, I went to jail for the first time. And at 21, there was an event that kind of really shook both my family and myself. My brother had he'd taken his own life in the backyard of our home, and I found him. As I mentioned, I was already going down kind of a downward spiral, and this just kind of accelerated that downward decline. And so when he took his life in 1995, I was 21, he was 27. I caught my first drug felony a few months before. And so I came home and I had to ask my parents to help me with, that I was in trouble again, and to help me, hopefully with a lawyer. Found my brother, and immediately, not too long after that, some so-called friends started coming around, and they looked like they were full of life, and it turned out that they were using cocaine. And so I went on a 3-year cocaine binge, wasted a lot of money, went into what is called a cocaine psychosis. If you alter your brain chemistry, I didn't know this. I just thought that you would have a heart attack and die. I didn't know that you could actually alter your brain chemistry to where it mimics that of a paranoid schizophrenic. And I was in that state for a while. So after about 3 years, went through a lot of cocaine, ended up in that cocaine psychosis, ended up going to jail, had a spiritual and religious experience as a Christian minister. I feel like I had a encounter with Jesus in a jail cell. However, I didn't know what to do with this newfound faith, and found myself back in prison in 2000. I had committed, unfortunately, I made a very poor decision. I committed 5 bank robberies, and I was actually in Montreal, Canada, when the FBI, Canadian Immigration, and Montreal PD came to get me. I remember waking up that morning. I was on the second floor of this, I'll just say, an apartment building in a particular house. And I woke up that morning, it was really quiet. I looked at this half-empty bottle of liquor and a half-empty bag of weed sitting on the table and thought, is this all I have to show for my life? And I realized why it was so quiet. And about a few minutes later, Canadian Immigration, Montreal PD with FBI in tow came kicking in the door. It was like a scene out of a movie. You heard a loud bang and then a flash bang, and it looked like the door was coming off the hinges. And I don't know if I thought to jump out that second story window, but I just believe the hand of God stopped me. And I was arrested, sentenced to 14 years in prison. When I got to this place called Downstate about a year into my sentence, Downstate is a peculiar type of place. It's a space that's supposed to be a reception facility. So when you come from the county jail and you go into state prison, this is one of the reception facilities you can go to. Some years later, a number of gentlemen and I were reading a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And in that, he chronicles, if you know the story, he goes to the concentration camps and he comes up with something called logos therapy. And he noticed that those that, logos Greek for meaning in this sense, not logic, but I did some studying of Greek too. Actually, I was adopted by a Greek family, so I learned to speak Greek before I spoke English. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So we're reading his book, and in it, he chronicles how the level of sanity that people had when they made it through their experience was that they somehow made meaning out of life and out of this whole experience. And those were the ones that made it through well. But what they had to make it through was he chronicles the introduction or the intake into concentration camps. And it was very similar to the way you come into prison. I'm sure not to the extreme.
Right.
But for example, being shackled almost naked next to somebody, having them strip off all your clothes, shave off all your hair, erase your name and give you a number. Mine was 01A0532, which represented that in 2001, I was the 532nd person to enter New York State prison. And the A stands for the reception facility that you go to, which meant downstate. I remember they give you this light soap, and when you put it on, the joke is that it takes a lot of water to get off, and it was January, so you can imagine how cold the water was. And they had it on the temperature of what it was outside.
Wow.
And these are in the mountains in New York. And the way they have it is that you pull on a lever and the water comes down from the top, and it was so ice cold, I thought I was gonna pass out. I remember having my name erased, and it wasn't my name that mattered anymore, it was the number. So eventually I was sent to Sing Sing. Sing Sing is a unique space in that the only thing I ever remembered from this movie is that if you ever watched the movie King of New York, at the beginning of the movie, Frank White leaves in a limo. Nobody walks out of there and leaves in a limo.
I heard a lot of stories about Sing Sing, actually.
Sure. I was actually in that cell block.
Wow.
I spent time in that cell block. It has the largest cell block in the country. I remember getting there and I could stretch out my arms and I could touch both sides of the cell. And it was me, 2 football lockers, a bunk bed, a toilet, and somebody else in the room. And it was at that time where when you're experiencing reality through bars, and Sing Sing is an interesting space because our current president, one time I was told, actually wanted to buy that particular parcel of land because it sits on the majestic Hudson. It has a spectacular view of the Hudson. And he wanted to put condominiums there. And so imagine having a lot of time to do, seeing the beautiful Hudson through the lens of metal bars. And so I think that does something to the psychological state of anybody. I mean, reflecting on the fact that at my best shot at life, my community had to lock me in a cage, literally like an animal. And immediately I knew that I needed to change my life. I needed to do something. I just didn't know what to do. The only thing I knew when I got to prison in 2000 was people that had been upstate before when I was still in the county system said that there were no higher education programs anymore. Because now we know that it was the 1994 crime bill signed into law by Bill Clinton that ended Pell Grant. And we're kind of in this moment right now where there's bipartisan support for some level of criminal justice and prison reform. And one of the items on the table is actually restoring Pell Grant eligibility. And so there were no higher education programs except for one program offered by New York Theological Seminary, a Master's of Professional Studies, offered in the infamous Sing Sing prison. And when you go to prison in New York, you have to go into something called transitional services. I don't know what you're transitioning into, but it's supposed to somehow get you acclimated to prison life, as if humans are meant to get acclimated to spaces like that. There's a process or that you can actually transition somehow into that space. I think it's a transition to dehumanization. That's the way I see it. However, so you have to go to transitional services, and the transitional services office was right next to the master's classroom. So I walked into the master's classroom by accident in 2001, thinking, how the blank am I ever going to get a master's degree? When there were no higher education programs, no bachelor's programs. Well, I spent about 4 months there, went up to Clinton, and I was taken from Canada. And Clinton, if you spit too far from the yard, you could probably hit Canada. And so there I was back upstate, way upstate, and no educational opportunities, but there was a program, I'll think of the name in a minute, they ended up going into network. And it was at that point where I started to see that maybe I could start to change my life. You take a number of certificate courses. It's supposed to be in a positive community. It was the first time I ever took a speaking class. Did pretty well. I don't know why, but maybe that was in the cards for me. And so eventually I got sent to Eastern Correctional Facility, and Bard College had just come in and started a program. Sure.
And what was that program about?
So it was the Bard Prison Initiative started by Max Kenner. And Bard wanted to come back in, and I think at the very beginning, if Max were to tell it, was to offer GED classes. And then that turned into offering Clemente courses, and then individual college courses. And so when I got in 2004, and the way I say it is, there were over 70,000 people in prison that year. Now, obviously, Bard would say that they don't take 15 out of 72,000. They take 15 out of the jail. So, for example, you have to get to that prison, but really there's 72,000 people in prison, and they take 15 at the time. There were a number of students already there. And I've always wondered what people could do if they just had access to the opportunity. So in order to get into Bard, you actually have to be in Eastern Correctional Facility. You have to have a GED. You have to get on the list to go and take the entrance exam, which at the time you would write a 2 to 4 page paper. And maybe about a tenth of the jail, maybe about 100, 150 people, maybe more, would write a 2 to 4 page paper. They would choose between 35 and 40 for an interview. And out of that 35 to 40, they chose 15. And in 2004, I was very fortunate enough to be one of the people that they selected, and it radically transformed the trajectory of my life. Prison was no longer just prison. It was also, I just wasn't a number. I was a student.
So that boosted your confidence. And
sure. And I think it's at the time, and I've written on this, is that in a very dehumanizing institution, it was the one space or the amount of times. If you think of prisons, they're kind of total institutions. And I think Irving Goffman talks about the difference between being on stage and off stage, meaning that there's times when we're out here, we can be off stage. We're not in the limelight. We're not in our particular roles, right? That we can have some level of a break. There's no break in prison. There's no off stage. And so and every aspect of it is regulated in such a way, from the bars to barbed wires, to the clothing you can and can't wear, to the regularity of the clothing for the guards. Everything is a constant reminder that you're an inmate, and that you're being defined by maybe your worst moment. And everything is a complete reminder of society's disapproval. I think what Foucault calls the gaze of the panopticon, right? That is this totalizing way to view someone that somehow it becomes a site of almost societal revenge. That's hard to take. So I'll finish here.
So this is an incredibly competitive program. You're able to get in. Why did Bard College do this? So this is the program where education has been kind of a neglected program within the prison system. And in order to get into this specific program, you had to have the happenstance of being at the specific facility. Why did Bard do this?
So again, I'm speaking on my own thoughts. I mean, I've heard people from Bard speak about it this way. I think to some extent, Bard saw a need. They have a love for education, and they wanted to, I think, reproduce the same college experience for people incarcerated.
That's awesome.
And that somehow there was value in every human being, and that every mind had intellectual capacity. And here is a group of untapped potential. And to bring in a quality education, to push people beyond what we probably thought we could do, to have the same standards. And to say almost 10 years to the day, I was back in that same master's classroom. Ended up getting an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree from Bard. Went back to Sing Sing, got the master's degree, met somebody on Yale Divinity School's advisory council. We were reading a textbook called This Odd and Wondrous Calling in the second semester of the master's program. I had just received 6 months off my sentence. So I was going home. My original out date was March 2012. I ended up getting out September 2011. And I met this gentleman who co-authored a book. Both of the co-authors were from Yale Divinity School. One was from Wellesley, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. The other is from Glen Ellen, which is right outside of Chicago. They were doing a book tour literally near Sing Sing. And our professor, because they were all in the same denomination, invited them in. I asked at the very end of the conversation was the possibility of somebody like me going to a place like Yale Divinity School. And after I got out, I went back to Albany, New York. I felt somewhat called to go back into use my education, to use, I believe, the level of transformation that happened and help my community. I mean, it was a difficult transition, to say the least. You know, I made some poor decisions after getting out, but I was able, I think, to weather those because of the level of not only just education I had, the support that I had. So I can imagine how hard it is for people that don't have that level of opportunity, don't have that level of access to opportunity. As Glenn Martin has said, you know, there's nothing exceptional about, he said, there's nothing exceptional about me. I just had exceptional opportunity. I feel the same way, that I just had exceptional opportunity where I could use the gifts I think that I had to really do something, I think, magnificent with my life. But
what was that? What was that like to go from being behind bars to being at Yale? Because I mean, like, I imagine myself, like, I have imposter syndrome, where I feel like, you know, I'm like, feel like really inadequate and stuff, what I'm doing, and you know, like, do you feel like there was a lot of pressure on you to succeed? Do you feel like, but it must have been, was it like a mixed emotions because you were kind of glad to be out, but you know, what was the environment like?
I was out a year. And so the life I was living, obviously I mentioned my crime, which was 5 bank robberies. It's not like I was in the work world, working with computers, growing in a career. So I had never used the internet. I was computer illiterate, basically, when I went to prison. And imagine going to sleep almost in 1999 and then waking up in 2011.
It's a huge transition.
And so a smartphone was foreign to me. And I would always hear stories about these stories about people that did a long time. But there was one story that we always used to laugh at, but the younger ones used to laugh at, not the people that were older, about somebody getting out of prison and going to buy a box of crackers and ran out of the store crying because there was too many box of crackers. And I went to a McDonald's I had been into a million times before. I actually played baseball, Little League, near this McDonald's. So I'd been there a million times before. And I see a sign for Wi-Fi. And people are on Wi-Fi. And it just seemed, it was this semi-familiar yet completely foreign space to me, where I felt like I wanted to cry, like I wanted to run out of the store. Wow. And so I would force myself to go into positive places, that is. For example, I would go into Starbucks and order coffee every day until the space started to feel normal. I wouldn't use my cell phone, or I wouldn't use Wi-Fi at home. I would always go to a coffee shop because these spaces just felt completely foreign and alien to me. And I would be in spaces where it felt like I was in a movie and everybody else knew that I was different. And people are just going about their lives. And here I am just feeling completely out of space, out of place. So a year out of prison, I went to Yale for a visit. And as soon as I got out of the car, it's just like I felt like I could breathe.
Really?
And wow. I just knew somehow I was coming there. So at the same time, the Yale Black Seminarians, a group at YDS at Yale Divinity School, got a hold of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, The Age of Colorblindness. And I didn't know this was going on. They lobbied the new dean and the school. They wanted to start a brand new tradition to where the school would buy a book for every student. They would have a conference on the book and then bring the speaker in. The very first book, was The New Jim Crow. Wow. A book on prison and criminal justice reform. And here's my application. To the best of my knowledge, and people I've talked to, I was the first person with a violent felony record to ever be accepted into Yale Divinity School. And I know that they had denied a number of people before me. Maybe, I mean, I'm not sure that it's specifically for the record, but I could understand the sense that they were probably thinking somebody coming out of prison within this short window, in short period of time, who has a violent felony, that's all they know, and has a great academic record. And I'm sure that created some level of tension because they're probably thinking about, I'm sure some people were thinking about the greater community, like what if this goes wrong, catastrophic thinking. Similar to the way people, when they come out of prison, think too, like catastrophic thinking. However, the new dean, they took a chance on me, and I'm glad they did, and it radically transformed my life. I got in 2013. I spent 3 years getting a Master of Divinity. Then I spent another 2 years getting the highest degree Yale Divinity School offers, which is the Master of Sacred Theology, and I graduated last year.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And I received one of my classes preaching awards.
That's awesome.
In 2016.
I mean, that's an incredible.
Very fortunate.
So what's the timeline between you going in and then you getting out at Yale? What's that, 15 years?
Wow. 13.
13 years.
I went in 2000, got into Yale in 2013.
Wow. And so you mentioned this book, The New Jim Crow. So
Sure.
So there's a New York Times article that came out recently talking about how there's over 1.5 million people in the United States that are incarcerated. It's the largest prison population in the world, including countries that are authoritarian regimes that have mass prison populations. They say there's more people behind bars in the United States than there are living in major cities. So if the U.S. prison population was a city, it'd be the 5th largest city in America after New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. The 5th city would be the prison population. And this is the interesting thing here is, in spite of crime rates having declined by over the past 25 years, we still have this huge prison population, and it affects people of color disproportionately, right? So African-American men receive prison sentences that are 6 times the rate of white males, even though they only make up 12% of the U.S. population. They make up 33% of the federal and state prison population. And then one of the challenges is recidivism, right? When people get out, almost half are rearrested, either for a new crime or violation of first supervision conditions. So this is sort of a system that's sort of stacked against individuals. You mentioned this conference about that, and what was your experiences in relation to some of those findings?
Yeah, so
at one point there's like personal choices, but you also feel like there's systemic biases that.
So I think it's both. Number one, I would say is if you look at the places where the majority of people that go to prison. There's one study, I think, by the Spatial Design Labs that looks at this thing called $1 Million Blocks. There was a study done by Eddie Ellis some years ago that looked at, and the findings may have been skewed to some extent. We found that 70% of the people in New York State prisons were from 7 neighborhoods.
Wow.
That's probably somewhat high, but it also talks about, for example, Brownsville, East New York, the South Bronx, East Harlem. These spaces, it seems that the spaces that are the poorest and most economically disenfranchised, that have the poorest schools, seem to be what some have talked about, kind of a school to prison pipeline or a community to prison pipeline. It's also spaces targeted where, if we were talking about sociology, Philippe Bourgeois' book, In Search of Respect, where, where the formal economy kind of fails, the informal economy will rise. So the response has not been economics, right? So the current literature kind of, if we take Michelle Alexander as maybe the text that kind of sets this conversation in a particular way, that people or scholars since then are kind of responding to her work. And there's a number of different streams. Some people are critiquing it, others are extending it. So, for example, Michelle Alexander kind of starts with Ronald Reagan and the war on crime, kind of as an extension of law and order politics from Nixon forward. Others are pushing that narrative back, actually looking at the Johnson administration and acts like the LEAA that kind of allowed the federal government to start funding localities, right? So, and then there's others that are saying, for example, like I know some of my friends at, especially like Josh Miller, is not going to be too happy for me mentioning Javon Fortner, but I will anyway. In his book, kind of The Black Silent Majority, that kind of looks at the Rockefeller drug laws and how some of the Black voices in the 70s kind of got co-opted into this tough on crime rhetoric that kind of set the stage for the creation. Others would push back and say that people people of color didn't have that level of agency to get anything passed back
Right.
then, but probably their voices may have been co-opted, and it may not have been as widespread as we thought.
Mm-hmm.
Or that others would say that, yes, there was a criminal justice or a public safety response that was asked for, but there was also schools. There was also asked for economic development. And many communities got heightened police presence in the welfare state. And that was a level of economic development, right? Or that was the response to issues where today we're seeing the same opioid crisis that hit New York City in the 70s, where there was a police response. Now it's a public health model.
Public
right?
health.
It's a public
completely
health.
different.
So there's
approach,
different types of responses. But also at the time, there was kind of a one-upsmanship going on, right? At the time where everybody had this tough on crime rhetoric, and nobody wanted to be soft on crime because it was a political issue that you could lose. Think of the Willie Horton effect in the 1980s. Where Bush Senior kind of gets catapulted in the polls after they show this ad of Willie Horton aligned with the other side, right? And so there was nobody saw it. So as a political issue, to be soft on crime meant that you were going to lose an election to some extent. And so I think the responses were who could come up with the tough on crime policies. And the next thing you know, you get the 1994 crime bill, even as crime is actually really slowly starting to decline over the years. And so when you think of a criminal justice response, you're going to get one type of thing. You're going to get prisons.
Right.
That's what the criminal justice system is meant to do. They're meant to go in and arrest people, not to create programs, not to put people into or think of different types of ways to address the situation. So I think that has helped to fuel the prison or the prison industrial complex. But I think there's another thing that's even if you think of deindustrialization and kind of rural communities being hit very hard by that, if you look at where most of the prisons are, especially in New York, they're in very rural areas that maybe over 80% of the middle class workforce works in a prison. So prisons also, I would say, prison building was also a way to respond to the economic decline in rural areas. And then once you do that, and you start to put an economic generator in that space,
which is very hard to dismantle.
You create an economy in there that's kind of looked at in a way that it's the generator's the feeder, but it's not looked at as welfare, right? Even though it's come from tax dollars. So prisons are kind of like rural welfare in one sense, that are providing $60,000 to $100,000 a year jobs, while in the cities, those same tax dollars are only providing food stamps and limited assistance in public housing. So I think how we're spending our tax dollars as well, but that's a whole nother.
Right. So, I mean, so that's interesting because that's a very relevant topic right now,
Sure.
the elections. I know that some of the candidates are being questioned about some of their tough on crime stances, and
Sure.
the progressive wing of certain parties are kind of like trying to basically hold them accountable. And so you've seen it from the inside, you're kind of seeing it from the outside. And so you were at Yale, and now you're at Georgetown University,
Sure.
right? And so what are you doing at Georgetown?
So I was hired by Georgetown to be the program manager. I was actually hired by the McDonough School of Business as an assistant director of program management. And in that capacity, I am the program manager for Georgetown University's prison or pivot program, which is a reentry program that's really a combination and a collaboration between Georgetown's Prisons and Justice Initiative, the McDonough School of Business, and also the DC Department of Employment and Services. And we offer a certificate in entrepreneurial skills. It's roughly between or entrepreneurship, around an 8 to 10 month process, where formerly incarcerated men and women are taking Georgetown courses in the liberal arts, in economics, marketing, entrepreneurial skills, and the liberal arts. Also with a paid internship, as you well know, as you're one of our internship employers, and you have 2 great fellows with you. And then the goal is that, some people go on to full-time employment, and or some people actually start their own ventures.
And how many people are in the program right now?
We have 15.
Great. And so tell me a little bit more about this cohort. Like what kind of, I know you mentioned Fifth Tribe, but I met a bunch of the fellows, and they're incredible. And in so many different ways. And, I remember one was like studying architecture. and I saw his designs, and my brother's an architect, and I was like, oh my God, you need to see this. I took a picture and sent it over.
Oh yeah.
So what are some of the places where they'd be getting internships?
Sure. So actually, I went to visit Corey at his internship at Torty Gallus, where he's working in an architecture firm, and to see him with others poring over blueprints, to see where he's spaced in terms of his desk and his work, that he's integrated into the space. They don't kind of have him off to the corner, but he's becoming an integral part and adding value to that organization. Also spaces like Prequel, where we have fellows that are doing coding checks and working with QuickBooks and developing accounting skills and understanding the how you run a business, how you run a restaurant. I also went to visit Common Cause, where one of our fellows was actually working on doing research, because there's going to be a major project called Zero Disenfranchisement that kind of comes out that will give an argument for why we should allow people inside of prison, not just off parole, to actually be able to vote, and doing research in support of that document that's probably going to be given to politicians to use as a means to have the research behind them for why we should create these types of bills. So there's a wide gamut, I think, of experiences and agencies that our fellows are adding value in all types of organizations, from for-profits to nonprofits, to spaces like yours, where I think we're starting to shape, I think, the narrative of what's possible with the human potential, I think, in everyone.
So for the listeners, like, can you explain? I mean, this is an incredible program, and I mean, sure. it's phenomenal how it's been organized, and your involvement with it. And why is it so hard for people that are incarcerated to get jobs in education? So you mentioned that the challenges that you faced while you were incarcerated, so people can get a sense of like, okay, a lot of these environments, they don't have a lot of educational opportunities because it's a political sort of point that politicians want to win. But even when they come out, why is it so hard to pursue educational opportunities and job opportunities and entrepreneurship? And I think there's a few stories of some of the fellows that you mentioned, and sort of the challenges that they faced.
Something, number one, there's just the whole stigma around a felony conviction. That somehow anyone that has a felony conviction is somehow dangerous and a danger to society. And if you think of what prisons look like and what they are and what they're meant to do, that they're meant to be spaces of punishment, because somehow somebody committed or didn't even commit a bad act, because not everybody that goes to prison is actually guilty, that automatically they're bad people. Even though we've moved to a correctional model in our nomenclature and in our language, they're really still prisons. They're not correctional facilities. We're not expecting people to go there and to become corrected, so to speak, as if there's something fundamentally flawed with individuals, right? So I think there's a fear of people with felony convictions. So when you have to check a box, or you have to say that you've been to prison, automatically, I think what comes to most people's mind is this is a high risk. And am I willing to take that level of a risk in my organization? And so, because most people, all they know is the felony conviction, what's in the public imagination, what's in the public consciousness at the time, on how we construct certain types of people and how we respond to them, that aids or adds to, I think, the discriminatory policies and practices that we see, that creates not just kind of the legal barriers, right, but also those psychological and those prejudicial barriers as well, to where people aren't willing to look past that. And we live in a society where we say, number one, people are innocent until proven guilty, which is yes. Then number two, that somehow we've paid our debt to society. But I think that whole framework kind of
stigma. It's
Yeah,
like a
you
scarlet
never.
letter.
Well, number one, you never pay a
Yeah.
debt to society. I mean, you owe, if you've done something wrong, you owe a debt to another person, not to so much to society, right? And so we've constructed this that somehow you've paid your debt to society, but yet the felony conviction still kind of excludes you from being really accepted into the community. I think that's why they've started to use terms like returning citizen. I don't think that that term really captures captures. It kind of widens, I think, the way that we're talking about this particular group of people. But it's still, we're talking about returning citizens, which still in the public imagination still means a felon. And I think that the best type of language to use is language that humanizes. And this is a term that's kind of being used to humanize that people are citizens. However, I know somebody from Cuba, and they're in this country, but they're not technically a citizen, so they're not a returning citizen. So others would argue, what if you were never part of the citizenry? What if you were part of in a community that was kind of ostracized and marginalized and kind of on the margins of society, where you never really felt that you could participate in society as a citizen? I think, however, the best of the what that term is trying to capture is the fact that people are coming back, that they're citizens, that they have rights, equals. Exactly, right. That they can participate and add value to the community and to society. Yes, it's not something we should be afraid of, but something that we should embrace, so that people, because actually the barriers that we're placing around people are not producing the types of responses that society wants. That's not leading to public safety, so to speak.
I think it's interesting as we talk about systemic discrimination.
And whatever public safety means.
Yeah, so exactly. So like one of the things that you'll hear about is like, oh, well, public safety is like the soundbite that people use to justify this discriminatory and excessive practices in incarcerated people. And I think we mentioned this stat about like almost half people have recidivism rate is really like it's pretty high. And I think when I heard the stories of the fellows at the opening event, and they were sharing their stories about how when they came out, like one lady, I think she mentioned she had like a master's degree and she was like, she's a teacher. And then she couldn't even get a job at Macy's. And what would happen is other people would get the job, then they would do the background check and say, and so that's an example of like public safety as a employment policy, right? But in a way that's kind of like, discriminatory in a sense that it's just a pretext to not hire people. And so you mentioned the formal economy, the informal economy. And so if you're a person who's getting out and trying to do the right thing, with the economic opportunities not there, then, what happens to that individual? And so this, individuals are sort of affected by this, the winds of society, right? And so what you guys are doing is awesome, because what you're giving them an incredible network. I mean, I've seen it at Georgetown at some of the, the guest speakers and the internships they're being placed at. The fellows that we've hired have grown incredibly fast, and they're super fast learners. Awesome. And I remember we put them through like our digital marketing training, and they were both kind of like, they're very like aggressive, and they're like, hey, put us on client work. And I was like, you guys don't realize you finished this training faster than anybody else in our entire company. You've actually gone farther in the training than anybody else has too. Like I haven't taken the AdWords exam yet as an example, and both of them passed the AdWords exam. They did display search, they did they did analytics. And so like for them it's like they didn't have the context of what learning is, and so like for them they felt like, I should be doing client projects, and we have them on client projects now. So that's the thing I realized was like just listening to their stories about how they couldn't even get like minimum wage jobs, and some of them before they were incarcerated, some of them had like pretty decent jobs, and they came out and they couldn't even get basic minimum wage jobs in retail or even working in restaurants, which I was kind of surprised to find that. And so this program is very unique. So why do you think the Pivot program is so important for society? So you mentioned that the educational opportunities are kind of lacking when you're incarcerated, and when you come out, it's challenging to get employment. So Pivot's one program in a country that has the largest prison population in the world. Why do you think Pivot is important to society? And how do you think you can change some of the challenges that our country is facing in this issue?
Sure. So one of the reasons why I think it's so important is we have a segment of society that with a felony or just with a criminal background or criminal record, that is completely excluded, I think, from human flourishing and the capacity to to flourish. People have hopes, people have dreams, they have aspirations. I don't think people grow up and in their minds as kids are saying, listen, I want to be an inmate. I want to go to prison. And so there is a drive and a determination to want to transform someone's life. And the way we do that in this country is the capacity to be a full citizen. And what that means is not just voting, but being able to have access to means of social upward mobility. Mm-hmm. And so our Pivot Fellows are geniuses. They have goals. They have dreams and aspirations. And it's just not to work in a minimum wage situation. Mm-hmm. They want to become entrepreneurs, but not only do they want to become entrepreneurs, they just don't want to do it for themselves. They want to be social entrepreneurs. They want to actually give back. Mm-hmm. They want to add value to their community. They see situations and circumstances in their community that they want to help to change. And becoming an entrepreneur can do that, to be able to give opportunities that were given to them to other people. And I think when we do that, society wins. I don't think society wins by relegating people into a permanent underclass for the rest of their lives. Because when I hear the term public safety, I wonder, what public are you talking about? Because if the majority of the people that go to prison go back to a particular community, if you're in that community, you don't want people coming back and committing new crimes. Mm-hmm. Because you don't want to create generations of new victims in that same community. Mm-hmm. Which means that if people coming back from prison were flooding into all different types of communities, how would we want to receive them back? What level of opportunities would we want for them? Because I think when they succeed, we succeed, society succeeds. But I think society has a vested interest in allowing real second chances for people that want to add value to their community and don't want to become a liability. Because I truly think, I believe in my heart, the greatest thing that I'll ever do is not coming to Pivot, is not going to Yale. It's the fact that I'm not hurting anybody. Mm-hmm. I've once lived a life that was where I was a liability to my community. And for those of our Pivot Fellows that feel the same way, that is just an added layer of a drive to want to become a change agent inside of your community. Mm-hmm. Because you don't want to see anybody else go through that on both sides, on the incarceration side, and you don't want to see anybody hurt anybody. Right. And so I think if we're really going to think about what is public safety, I think we need to broaden our understanding of what public and community is, mm-hmm. where it's just not specific types of communities, right? But yet it's a broader, I think, societal good for programs like this to exist. Mm-hmm. That help people, I think, tap into that human potential, have capacity for flourishing.
All right, I'm going to ask one final question.
Sure.
Since we're almost running out of time, how can we help? I run a business. There's lots of businesses here in the DC area.
Donate.
So donate. How do we donate? Where do we go?
So I think one of there's a few things for those that own businesses. Reach out to the Pivot program. Think about having a Pivot Fellow. I believe that this program is going to flourish. It's going to continue. It's going to grow. We need partners. We want partners. So if there's businesses watching, consider employing a Pivot Fellow. If there's those that have financial means to be able to give, we could always use financial means. Also, for those that may be executive coaches, that help other people create businesses that have that type of intellectual capital. So you want to leverage the capital that you have. Mm-hmm. And so as an institution of higher learning, education is the capital that they bring. And for the McDonough School of Business, it's creating businesses. So Georgetown is leveraging the capital in these particular spaces to effectuate change. Mm-hmm. So bring the capital that you have, join us as a partner. And I think that we can transform lives and generations. Definitely. And make our communities better.
And what's the website if people want to visit and learn more about this program?
Pivot.georgetown.edu.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. I wanted to thank to George for coming on. I really think you should write a book. I don't know if you're already doing one.
Oh, wow.
But that was an incredibly informative interview. I learned a lot. I think you have a lot of wisdom. It's a pleasure to have you on. I met you. We kind of connected over talking about pizza in New York.
Sure.
And so I was like, oh, your story is amazing. And I really wanted to, just help broadcast and amplify your voice in whatever way I could. Let me know how I can help. Fifth Tribe has got Pivot's back. We'll do whatever we can to support the program. If anybody else is out there, as George mentioned, please hire the Pivot Fellows. Reach out if you have employment opportunities, internships,
Definitely.
And donate. And you can go to the website to learn more. That's all for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. And if you have any other questions, I'll put George's information in our YouTube channel, and you can check it out. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good night.
Hoya Saxa.
Hoya Saxa.